Okay, thank you. Well, what I would like to do is build on the excellent introduction we had yesterday in some depth about what's happening to Canada from Charles and another colleague, to look on a comparative basis between three countries, Canada, Australia and New Zealand, that are what I term competitors and collaborators for skilled migrants. So we are hugely influenced by each other's policies. We share our data in a very transparent way with each other, and the degree of copying whatever works is very striking, as I'm going to demonstrate, particularly in the recent period. I think Canada moving much more towards the Australian and New Zealand models. So just to give a quick snapshot of a decade back, when I was commissioned by the Canadian and Australian governments to compare our degree of reliance on migrant professionals by field, if you look at the right-hand column, you will see there was already a huge level of dependence. And in fields like engineering and computing, close to half of everyone with a degree in that field in Canada was already an immigrant, ditto in Australia. And in medicine, it was also a very striking representation. Now, moving to the green column in the middle, you'll see that that process has continued to accelerate. And based on the Australian census of 2011, 62% of all our engineers were immigrants, and close to 60% in computing, etc. Now, of course, some came as children, but what you find when you analyse the data is up to 25% had come in the previous 5 years. So it has been an extraordinary intake of degree qualified professionals. And the big challenge for the three governments with proactive skilled migration policies is which of the pathways do we want to prioritise, and by what mechanisms do we wish to select? Here, I'm not going to focus on the yellow groups. Those are the people who come as family migrants or refugees, acknowledging that very many of them are also skilled. But on the groups at the top, we proactively select. So the first three groups are very fluid. They move often on a temporary basis, and there's typically no annual cap, for example, with bilateral agreements or, temporary skilled migration. When it comes to permanent skilled migration, all these countries set annual quotas, or in the case of New Zealand, 3-year quotas. And between them, we've got the international students, whom I won't focus on a great deal here because I'll be addressing them in depth in the next section. So, first of all, in the decade to 2010, we had certain absolutely shared strategies. So the goals of each of our countries were not merely economic growth, but population growth. And the definition countries adopted of success for a skilled migrant is somebody who is quickly integrated in the labour market, utilising their skills, and the case of Australia, making a positive fiscal contribution. Alongside with this kind of overarching value, the 5 key things we shared is first, up to 70% of our permanent intakes have been reserved for people with skills. The second thing is what I call the privatisation of skilled migration, and I'm going to illustrate that later. But basically, the key determinants of much of the selection now is not points-based selection criteria. It's employer sponsorship or state and territory sponsorship, which pushes you to the head of the queue. Priority processing is the new paradigm. The third thing, and I'll illustrate this, is the growing dominance of the temporary worker flows. Remember, they have no cap. So they have been very volatile in the recent period, and this has led to growing concern to a degree in both Canada and Australia. The selection paradigms have greatly changed with 2-step migration processing through the expression of interest mechanism, which New Zealand initiated, the norm for 2 countries and shortly Canada. But more importantly, we have been using the research evidence to constantly fine-tune migration policy because we want to see which pathway works in terms of national goals. But let me highlight to 2010 the differences between our three countries, and they were very significant. So Canada's intakes, as we've heard, were very disproportionately skilled, and in fact there were a higher proportion degree qualified than Australia, although Australia's was extremely high. The source countries for Canada were very diverse, and the big difference is that they had negligible numbers who were native English speakers by a decade back. It had shrunk to about 4 or 5% of degree qualified immigrants. And in terms of selection, there was no mandatory screening as a condition of entry for language ability or for the likelihood of qualifications being recognised. The study migration pathway was established but relatively late and initially quite slender, and the processing time lags were huge. According to three ministers back in 2008, it was up to 10 years for skilled migrants, and people could die in the queue. Okay, so what were some of the challenges Canada had been facing and indeed recognised 15 years back? Well, the first thing was extreme challenges in getting people quickly into their own profession. This is census data, but the bulk of the engineers coming in that time had been through the skilled pathway. And if you looked at them, there were extreme differences between variable source countries and often countries that were making up very large immigrant flows, such as China, Philippines, Pakistan and India, were doing the worst or amongst the worst in getting work quickly. Now, this is a huge challenge because we have clear data from the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, and I've given you here much more recent data as to where employers want to pick skilled workers. And if you look at the left-hand column for Canada, for the Temporary Foreign Worker Visa, leaving aside the Mexicans, who are basically agricultural workers, overwhelmingly they want people from OECD countries, and if possible, comparable levels of development who are native English or French speakers. And it's a much smaller proportion of places for India, Philippines, etc. Australia, might I add, shows a directly comparable preference from employers. And I've done many, many years of interviewing with employers in multiple STEM fields. They say in the knowledge economy, communication and technological fit is critical. So this brings us to one of the problems Canada and all of our countries have been grappling with. The world is at very different stages of educational resourcing and technological development. And this is data from the Shanghai Jiaotong Global Rankings of universities, which are regarded as relatively unbiased. Now, we heard yesterday about the degree to which China is leaping up those rankings paths. But if you look at the data every year, as I do on India, India seems at the moment to be stuck. Still only 2 institutions in the world top 500, despite the enormous growth of migration flows and development of the economy. This then plays through very powerfully at what happens when people arrive unfiltered into Canada without mandatory language checks in the past and without qualification screening. And again, this is some early comparative data, but if you look at India, for example, keeping in mind India by then was the top source for foreign medical graduates to Canada as it was to Australia. Just 19% got back into work in medicine in the first 5 years, 66% in Australia. We were common with China and we were common with South Africa, but there were great differences between groups. So basically, Canada by 2010 was really interrogating the model of selection for skilled migrants, which had been prevailing for a substantial period of time. The so-called human capital model, where it was your level of qualification, for example, degree that mattered, but it was very neutral about where that degree was gained and what the likelihood was of you getting employment in that field in Canada. To give you another engineering example, I'll never forget talking to the key engineering body about 8 years back about Afghanistan engineers who were being admitted with comparably regarded engineering degrees, for example, to Canada or UK. And I was told they might have to take 24 exams to get full recognition, as well as having a year of Canadian experience. So there were big challenges which Charles went into yesterday, and I won't repeat here. The key point to note is that Canada seemed to be stuck for a period of time, different reports citing somewhat variable figures, to around 2/3 of skilled migrants at best employed within the first 6 or 12 months post-settlement, and a long time to get wage parity, if ever, to Canadians. I'll come back to the reforms since. Now, coming to this issue, there are multiple ways we can look at the impact it has when you don't bar different countries of origin, but you filter them more objectively. And this is data from Australia in relation to health sector. Since 2009, if you're qualified in a regulated field that mandates a certain level of English to practice for registration, that becomes the default requirement for pre-migration English language screening. And you can see this has a very marked impact. If you look at doctors, 52% pass that test on their first or multiple attempts. And when it comes to nursing, it's 17%. And very low pass rates, for example, from the Philippines. In terms of source countries pooling all the health fields, you'll see that there are highly variable outcomes. And this data also raises interesting questions, because we currently mandate passes in speaking, listening, reading and writing since 2010. And if you look at the UK, you'll see what happened to UK health professionals. Once reading and writing were included in the test, only half passed. So we do have to think very carefully and with a research base about testing. Australia, in contrast to Canada, has been getting increasingly strong employment rates at 6 months. And I think it's skipped back, to the key differences. From 1999, Australia did major reforms for its skilled migration selection strategy. Like Canada, we greatly prioritise skills. So 2/3 of the intakes are skilled, and of those, 2/3 are professionals. The source countries are also highly diverse, but unlike Canada, we maintained and in fact somewhat increased a significant number of people who are native English speakers, which is also a proxy for training in OECD countries. However, in the period up to 2010, only 17% of our skilled migrants were native English-speaking professionals, and 8 of our top 10 sources were Asia. The key differences we'd introduced was some kind of assessment of occupation, which proved to be highly flawed. I won't go into that. Mandatory screening for English and pre-migration qualifications screening as a condition of eligibility to lodge an application. We also introduced the study migration pathway in 1999 with vast take-up. Again, it's proven complex. I'll talk about that after the break. And our processing time lags were relatively short compared to Canada's. Now, in that context, we knew by 2009 to 2011, we were getting very good employment outcomes in global terms. So if you look at the top, working full-time in yellow, 92% of people selected by employers were working full-time. And of those, 90% were in a job that was skilled, categorised as professional or managerial level. And the people who were selected offshore, that's the middle circle, were also doing pretty well. So in terms of the offshore, 76% were employed full-time, and the bulk of those were also in skilled work. The big challenge for Australia was the international students. So they were employed at far lower wage rates and also far less likely to be in skilled jobs than had been presumed by the government. I'll go into that after the break. However, it was very clear that after 7 or 8 years of implementing more stringent selection criteria, we did not have reduced demand, we had not wiped out Asia at all, and we were getting much better employment outcomes. So I've got the relative figures in the yellow column for medical migrants who were there in the first 5 years, and you'll see that even groups who are relatively disadvantaged, for example, Filipinos, 47% were in work in their profession in a fairly short period of time, India doing well, etc. This matters a lot because if you look at the right-hand column, you'll see the bulk of those medical migrants were no longer from the UK. They were from India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, China, etc. Okay, so coming to the most recent data for Australia, STEM migration is extremely important. And this data is for the very recent period on the right-hand column up to June 2014. I just received it on Thursday. The important point to note is the bulk of the people who are selected are not selected through the permanent pathway. It is being employer and state driven. They're coming on a temporary basis. And there is a lot of attraction for this. They're fast-tracked. They come to prearranged work, and there's the capacity to turn the tap on, off, depending on the economic cycle. So if you look at engineering, there's been a recent decline, and you can follow that through. Mining engineers are now only coming through the temporary program. There's very few as permanent migrants. In terms of where employers want to pick people, it's very interesting to see. Not only is employer selection now far more important than it ever used to be for permanent as well as temporary skilled migrants, but they want to get them on shore. So they're looking at the former international students and the temporary foreign workers, people they can see and whom they can check out in terms of attributes. Overall, the government has been fairly happy, except for concerns about temporary migration issues and the study migration pathway with outcomes. And if you can see at the top, the average skilled migrant, if you pool all those groups, including the students, has got a 68% chance of being in a skilled job within a year, 6 months. And that's the rate for the family migrant who's unfiltered in advance. So it is an enormous difference, which also translates to salary. Coming now briefly to New Zealand. Well, New Zealand regards migration as what they term demographic survival. In a 50-year period after the Second World War, they brought in over 2 million migrants, and that gave them a net population gain of just over 200,000 people. 10% of their population, I think, is currently resident in Australia. Their intakes, when I compared them in a big report for the two governments a couple of years ago, have some very significant differences. First, New Zealand gets far less skilled people at every level of intake. The permanent skilled migrants, the temporaries, and also, interestingly, the international students. And this may not have been a problem in the past when the main industries were agricultural and tourism. But New Zealand wants to repitch itself towards high-tech industry. So this is now a matter of growing concern, and there's a very relevant new OECD report around these issues. The second thing is they brought in not merely screening for English language ability, but a decade back they mandated high levels. On the IELTS score, it was 6.5. Australia at that time was IELTS 5. It subsequently went to 6. And they brought in pre-migration screening if people were qualified. But what this led to is a complete difference in the immigration patterns. Close to half of all the skilled migrants they select are native English speakers, And beyond that, there's a very strong bias towards OECD countries such as France, Germany, in Northwest Europe. The study migration pathway is established, but again, it's filtering through lower skilled people. And the temporary labour migrants, again, replicate this pattern. Now, the key thing for New Zealand is not just the scale of New Zealand reliance on temporary foreign workers and foreign workers in select fields like medicine, but the problem of retention. And I want to illustrate that. If you look at the engineers New Zealand trains, even its own New Zealand citizens, a third have gone within 3 years. But when you look at medicine, which is 42% of New Zealand's medical workforce, they lose a third of those foreign doctors within a year and 2/3 within 3 years, typically to Australia. And the ones most likely to leave are the most registrable and the relatively young, trained in comparable OECD systems. So there are huge challenges for New Zealand. Now, in conclusion, what has happened in the current period is a major policy convergence between the three countries. Canada has a will to reform, a different government, as Charles said yesterday. And in essence, I think, Charles, by next year, everything Australia or New Zealand has done which seems to work, Canada will have adopted. So there will be an escalating competition for us because Canada will certainly give us a run for our money. And in this process, we use that research evidence which each country has established to constantly assess policy changes and their impacts 2 or 3 years later, and then fine-tune the selection mechanisms. In terms of maximising labour market outcomes, what we are all doing now is wedded ourselves to two-step migration, pre-migration English screening, quals assessment, much greater levels of sponsorship, which is huge for New Zealand. 80 to 80%, 88% of all permanent skilled migrants are already in New Zealand and employed or with a job offer at the point of selection. So risk is removed from the process. And we've been refining our assessment of what occupational need there is, what level of experience, etc., to compete globally for the best and the brightest package. The scale that each of us offers is very large in contrast to the UK, for example, as we heard yesterday. So if you look at the temporary flows to the left, they're much harder to count because they only include often the principal applicant, that is the worker. We usually exclude the family members coming along with them. And it is a very buoyant field. Canada, as Charles said, is now sharply contracting that pathway. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens. New Zealand, by contrast, had an enormous pathway coming because that was what was feeding skilled migration. But as the OECD report just noted, New Zealand's pipeline to skilled migration through temporary foreign workers has halved since the global financial crisis. And in fact, it's getting very hard for New Zealand to fill those quotas it's establishing on the right-hand side. So in conclusion, the differences between us have largely vanished. Each country, though, has significant challenges to address. Canada's clearly are to get improved skilled migration outcomes in terms of early employment, and every selection mechanism they've adopted, modelled on Australia or New Zealand recently, is designed to deliver that. The Canadian experience class is minute so far. It's less than 5,000 people last year. So that's been a disappointment from what I've been told by the key policymakers. And there's a need to secure higher level value from programs like the Living Caregiver program. Australia I'll talk to separately about study migration later, but we've just had a review, as you've heard, of the temporary labour migration program. And for New Zealand, the big challenges are going to be to attract enough people at the right skill level in an increasingly competitive global OECD environment, and also to retain people with the right skill level to match the industries that are going to meet the future economic goals. Thank you.